Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here. Today, we dive into the world of Vampire the Masquerade, where you'll control a group of vampires who seek to dominate the city of San Francisco. You'll be attacking foes, gaining titles, advancing your agenda, and hunting mortals. Vampire the Masquerade Rivals Expandable Card Game is for 2 to 4 players, takes 30 to 70 minutes to play, is for ages 14 and up, and published by Renegade Game Studios. Today, I'll be doing a rule school where I'll teach you how to set up and play the game so that you don't have to read the rulebook yourself. Now, I've placed timestamps below me in the description of this video just in case you want to jump to a specific section of the rules. Without further ado, let's get started. Vampire the Masquerade Rivals Expandable Card Game is for 2 to 4 players, where each player will have their own coterie of vampires. You're trying to either be the first to get 13 agenda points, and you'll be getting those specifically by your faction's agenda. And only one other player is your rival, and if you knock out their last vampire, then you'll win that way as well. On your turn, you'll be sending vampires maybe out to the streets to take out some mortals who will attach to you and give you some different abilities. And when attacking, you'll be using different types of attacks like mental, physical, or social. You'll also be conducting schemes where you'll be getting yes or no answers from the rivals, and you'll be using influence in order to get that. Or maybe you'll be putting titles and attaching those, giving yourself some really powerful abilities. Or maybe you're doing conspiracies, which are secretly trying to get people involved to extort different prestige from them. And once you're familiar with the preset decks, you can open up this crypt pack and start creating your own decks. So let's see if you have what it takes to take out your rival first or to get to 13 agenda points. To set up, you're first going to find the city deck that has the Golden Gate Bridge motif on the card backs. From that deck, you're going to find all 10 event cards. They'll say event, or they might say event ongoing. You're going to separate those from this deck. From those 10 event cards, you're going to shuffle them and remove 4 of those cards. These will be placed back in the box without looking at them. You'll now be left with 6 shuffled event cards, and you're going to shuffle these back in with the rest of the city deck. And so now you have a single 23 card city deck, and you'll place that near the middle of the table. Next, each player is going to select a color and take the corresponding prestige tokens. Now notice that the colors are blue, orange, black, and red. Now also notice that these tokens are double-sided. They have prestige on one side and blood on the other side. Once you've selected your color, you'll take a total denomination of 20 and place them in front of you with the prestige side up like this. All the rest of your prestige tokens will be in the middle of the table for a general supply. There are 4 individually wrapped preset decks. Each of them have 49 cards. Now these actually come wrapped separately. There's also a separate deck that says stop. This is a separate deck that you'll use later. This is used after your first few games once you want to construct your decks and customize them. So this can be left in the box, but each player is going to take one of these full preset decks. Now, if for some reason you shuffle the decks together or if you mix the cards up, you can always go to vampirerivals.com/pre-constructed-decks, and that will allow you to see which cards are in which decks to reset them up. Each of these pre-constructed decks come with 40 library cards, 7 faction cards, 1 haven, and 1 agenda card. And the 7 faction cards all come from the same faction. So if you're familiar with Vampire the Masquerade, you can look at the deck, see which factions are which, and pick the one that you like best. If you're not really familiar with them, on page 4 of the rulebook, it talks about the different factions and sort of their style. Next, each player is going to take their agenda card and place it face up in front of them. And next to that, they'll take their haven card and place it face up. Below the agendas, you'll place your 40 card library deck and you'll shuffle it up and you'll have it face down here. For your first few games, find the vampire with the highest blood potency value in the upper left. In later games, choose any vampire as your leader. You'll take that card out and put it face up, leave some room next to it, but put it right here. The rest of your faction deck will get shuffled and placed like this. Now this starting vampire is your leader. So you're gonna take the leader token of your color, and that's the color of your tokens, your prestige tokens. You're gonna take also the prestige token from your own supply, that was a denomination total of 20, and you'll take those and you'll flip them over to the blood side equal to the blood potency number on your leader. So this is a 6, so I have 2 3s here. Again, these were the prestige markers. We'll flip them over, they're now the blood markers, and this came from your own personal supply of 20. You can also give each player a player aid. Now your leader is just going to gain 1 influence, and that's going to help them participate in various political activities, and this will always be your leader for the rest of the game. This will never get removed. Now you're going to assign randomly a first player. Let's say it's the red player. Now I've just set these leaders up. They're usually on each player's leader vampire, but I just placed them here to say this player's sitting here, this player's sitting here, here, and here. There's a 4-player game sitting around a table, if you will. Now let's say the red player is the first player. Now the player to its left is considered player 2, player 3, player 4. Now there are these player tokens 1 through 4. You'll use an amount of these depending on the amount of players. So if there's 4 players, you'll use 4 of them. If there were only 3 players, you'd use 1, 2, and 3. If there were 2 players, you don't have to worry about them. So in this case, we're playing a 4-player game. We'll mix up all 4 of those and place them face down. Then starting with the first player, they're going to take one of these randomly. If they happen to take the one that is their player number, their first and it's 1, they just put it off to the side and they take another one. Then they'll take theirs and they'll mix it back into the deck so the other players don't know what it is. And you'll do that if you pull your own player number. So let's say this is how it looked after all the players have taken one and they don't have one that is their own number. This is going to show you who your rival is, and this is very important because, as we'll get to later, knocking out your rival is one of the ways to win the game. Now here we have the first player, and again this is the second player, third player, fourth player. The first player's rival is the second player. So this player, their rival is this player. This one is the fourth, which is this player. So this player's rival is this orange player. This player's rival is the third player, which is this one, and this player's rival is the first player, which is this one. So everyone has a different rival depending on this. And if you're just playing a 2-player game, the other player is just simply your rival, and you don't have to worry about using these tokens at all. Then the first player is going to draw 4 cards from their library and 1 card from their faction deck. All other players are going to draw 4 cards from their library, just like the first player, but they're going to draw 2 cards from their faction deck instead of just 1, and that's for all players other than the first player. And finally, you're going to place the no influence tokens and all of these agenda tokens off to the side. There's 3 ways to win this game. 1, if you're the first player to reach the 13 agenda points as shown here. The other is if you knock out your rival that we talked about earlier. And the third is a condition that doesn't happen as often, so we'll go over that later. Now, agenda points are given by your agenda, which is different from each player, and these will make more sense after you've watched the rest of this video on how those work and the different language and how you get those points. But you'll also get agenda points by defeating or burning a vampire in your rival's coterie, which we'll also learn about throughout the game. As shown on your player aid, the game is played over 3 phases, with each of those phases having multiple steps. The first one is the beginning phase. Now in the first turn of the game, it's a little bit different. The first step of the beginning phase is the city deck step. And because it's only the first turn of the game, the first player is going to take a certain amount of cards depending on the amount of players and put them out here. So we're playing 4 players, you'd put that many cards out, 4. You always put the exact amount of cards as number of players. That's why we have 4 cards out here. Now, if you have any cards that say event ongoing, you'll take a token from the general supply, not your supply, it's the general supply in the middle of the board, and you'll place it on here. This is going to let us know that when it comes to your turn again, that's when we'll get to burn that card and get rid of it. This is an ongoing event for a full round. If there are cards that say event, you will resolve these cards and then you'll burn it, meaning removing it from the game. For example, this one says players may discard up to 2 cards, and for each card they discard, they gain 1 prestige. Again, you would gain that prestige from the general supply and put it into your own. And again, any standard events are resolved and always burnt, meaning they are taken out of the game. They're not in a discard pile. Now we'll go over the different types of cards a little bit later, like mortals, retainers, and things like that. So we're just gonna skip right down to the next phase, which is the action phase. We're gonna come back around to this beginning phase after we've gone through a full round of the game, where the other steps will make more sense. Now during this action phase, the active player is going to perform 2 actions, and they're all listed on your player aid. Now you're gonna perform 2 of these, and there's different kinds, like you could just simply draw a card. And when doing so, you can draw 1 from your library or 1 from your faction deck. And notice it says unhosted. This means it's an action that doesn't require any of your vampires to be exhausted, meaning rotating them 90 degrees. So an unhosted action, you just get to take it without modifying or using any vampires. The next possible action you can take is recruiting a vampire. Now you must have this in your hand, like we might have just drawn a card and got a faction card in our hand and we want to recruit that vampire. So you take a vampire from your hand and you'll place it in your haven. Your haven is an area that's sort of close to all your other cards. This is actually your haven card, but if you remember your leader vampires here, and you'll place any vampires that you recruit here as well. These are all considered being in your haven. This will be important a little bit later. Now when you do that, you're also going to look at the blood potency number 3, and remember to take a token from your own supply, flip it to the blood side, and place it on that vampire. And keep in mind this is also an unhosted action, so you don't need to exhaust any vampires to perform this action. Now during your first turn of the game, it's pretty typical that you're going to want to recruit a vampire, because a lone vampire is easy to target, and losing your only vampire would end the game immediately. Now remember, you only get 2 actions, but I'm going over all of them for you. You might play an action card, and you play this one, it says action. We're going to go over what these different action cards do, but if it just says action, you must use a vampire to take this action, meaning you must exhaust one of your vampires regardless of the location and turn it 90 degrees like this. And now that basically this vampire is helping you do this action. Again, we're going to do these later. Now normally you will finish this action and then this card will go to your discard pile. However, if you play an action card that says unhosted action, then you don't need to use a vampire and exhaust it in order to do it. And also if it says ongoing, you'll keep this card just to the right of your haven and it will stay here as the card says. Again, we're going to go over what these different action cards are later. The last action we'll talk about is the attack, but first let's talk about your haven in the streets. We have 2 ready vampires. They're ready because they are not exhausted. That's exhausted, and this is either unexhausted or known as ready. Any of your ready vampires can move from the haven, which they are now, and we'll talk about what the advantages are that are being in your haven later. But you can move any of these into what's known as the streets, which is a general area in the middle of the table. For example, maybe I move this vampire all by itself. Now this is considered a 1 vampire party. It's all by itself. Now you can never move from the streets back to the haven during your turn, but anytime during the action part of your phase, you can, it does not cost you an action, you will be moving vampires to the streets, possibly from your haven, or possibly splitting up parties. For example, let's say our leader is out there in the streets. We could bring this other vampire out and decide to either have it by itself, which is just separating it a little bit, or putting it right next to it, showing that it is part of this party. Now you can always rearrange your ready vampires as much as you wish into any number of parties unless an action is underway. But let's say we just brought Ty Smith here by himself. Now on the back of your player aid, it has the exact attack sequence that we're about to go through. So the first thing you'll do is you'll attack Declaration. Now I'm going to attack with this vampire in the streets, so I will turn it sideways so it is exhausted. And now you can only attack a vampire from another player, a foe, or one of the mortals in the streets. However, you can never attack vampires controlled by a foe who is yet to take their first turn. Now, if this vampire was in a party in the streets with an exhausted vampire, it would need to separate itself from that vampire before it exhausted. And conversely, if they were both ready here in the streets, and I exhausted this one, they still stay in the same party. So I'm going to show you a basic attack with this one vampire against one of these 2 mortals in the streets. Let's say we want to fight this one. We'll see, we need to give him damage of 3 or above. So we can do either a physical attack, a social, or a mental. In this case, we're going to do a physical attack. Now in this case, if I want to play an attack card, I can, and since I'm just fighting a mortal in the streets, I just play it face up. So I have a value of 1 right here because I'm doing a physical, but I also have this baseball bat. Now I need to have a blood potency. Now it doesn't matter the amount of blood that's actually on this vampire, just the blood potency here is 3. I have to play a card that's 3 or less. This has a 1, so it's okay. It's going to do 1 damage, and it is this type of attack. I have to play an attack card that has the type of attack that I claimed I was doing. And then I get +1 to a city deck mortal, which is what this is. So I have 1 + 1 plus another 1, 3, it equals this, so I have defeated. Now this will go into my discard pile, and I'm also going to get 1 agenda point. So I'll put that on my agenda card. Remember, when you get to 13, that's one way to win the game. So it says when defeated, gain 1, which we just did. And then we choose burn, which is basically removing it from the game, but mending 3. And that essentially would give us 3 up to 3 blood to our maximum blood if we needed it, and would come from the general supply. We would take that of our color, and we would be able to basically put it on here to add 3 to them. But we're already at the max, so we don't really need to do that, but we can attach them. And when we attach them, this will go to the bottom of this card. This will sort of get attached. And we could draw a card and we gain this, which will, these icons will, different attributes that will combo with other cards and effects in the game. So we can attach this and it allows us to draw a card. We can choose to draw which deck to draw from, our library or our faction deck. Now let's cover a more in-depth example of attacking. Let's say these two vampires are in the streets. I've just brought them really close to this haven here, just so you can fit it all on camera, but let's assume they're in the streets and they're going to attack over here. So they're going to decide to attack with Skunk, so they will exhaust, and they will declare who they're attacking, and they attack the leader. Now earlier we mentioned that being in the haven does something for you. It does. Characters in your haven have +1 secrecy, which means in order to be attacked while you're in your haven, the attacking player needs to discard a card from their hand for each secrecy. In this case it's +1, so they had to discard 1 card out of their hand in order to make this attack into the haven. Then they're going to announce the type of attack. It's going to be physical. It has a value of 1 there. And optionally, you can play a card. Remember, he's going to need to be playing a card that is a physical type there. So now the other player, the defending player, can declare a block if they want to. If you have 1 or more vampires, in that party, they can decide to use one of them to block. Now they do this. Now you can't do that against a ranged attack. We've talked about physical, social, and mental. There's another one called ranged that different cards will help you do ranged attacks. You can't block against one of those. But this player is going to block because it's a physical attack. And so this player is now the target of that attack. And now this player can also decide to play a defensive card face down. So she is going to place that right over here. Now the attacker is going to reveal their card. And they reveal Sucker Punch. Remember, the blood potency had to be higher or equal to this, which it is. It had to be a physical type, which it is. And it's eventually going to do 2 damage here, but targeted. You may retarget the attack to any legal target in the opposing party. And this was the blocker, but now they can retarget it towards the original person that they were trying to hit, which they will do. Then the defense reveals Steal the Spotlight. It is the right type of card. It's a physical, and they have the right amount of blood potency. There's no choices to be made down, so we'll hold on to that for just a minute. And taking a closer look, we can see that Brother's party ability allows him to exhaust to add 1 damage to the attack. So now the attacker is going to resolve or exhaust Brother to try to give it 1 more of the physical hit there. So as of right now, we have 2, 3, and 4 physical damage being aimed towards our leader. But now this Steal the Spotlight is going to resolve, and Skunk is going to lose 2 because if this character was a blocker, which it was, the attacker loses 2. So this player is going to lose 2 blood. Now our leader is about to take 4 damage, but we have a 1 on physical, so it's going to reduce that by 1. And if we look closely, they have a mortal that they had defeated in an earlier turn, and it's attached, and they can exhaust this to prevent 1 damage to this character. So they will exhaust that mortal just like that and reduce 1 more damage. So they've reduced it from 4 to 2. Now just note that the 2 defense from this card does not apply to our leader because it was played by the other vampire that was blocking. And so 2 damage does hit her. And that's a much more in-depth type of, attacking situation that might actually arise in gameplay. And of course, on your player aid, it actually goes through this exact attack sequence right there. Now let's talk about what happens when a vampire gets to 0 blood. There's a couple different ways this can happen. One of the ways I want to talk about is aggravated damage. Aggravated damage, they cannot be essentially reduced by the attributes depending, regardless of the type of attack that this card came from. But if it's aggravated damage, like in this case it says deal 1 damage to each of the characters in the opposing party. So let's say this cocktail was thrown at us and it did this 1 aggravated damage. We have 1 blood left. If you get to 0 blood, and during that, you were dealt at least 1 aggravated damage, the vampire and any cards attached to it are burned, meaning they're removed from the game. There is one exception to this, but I'll talk about that later. Now, even though you can't reduce aggravated damage with one of your attributes, you can reduce it with defensive cards and things like that. Now, if you're getting hit with damage that's not aggravated and you go to 0 blood, your vampire is essentially going to go into Torpor. Now, what this is, it's a spot that's separate from your active vampires, so you know that it's sort of in Torpor. You would then burn all of your attached retainers. So this retainer would go out, it would get burnt, so it would be burnt and placed out of the game. You'd also discard every other card that's attached in here except title cards. We're going to get into detail what these title cards do later, but if you have these, they do not get detached. So when this happens, you'll actually exhaust your vampire, and you'll take 1 prestige token from your supply, not the general supply, and you will flip it over to give it 1 blood. This is mending. This is the beginning of the mending that we're going to talk about now. So it's gaining blood back, and eventually it's going to try to get back to this full blood potency number where it can come back into play. Now, defeating and burning your rival's vampires is a way to gain agenda points. So let's say we had either burnt or defeated one of our rival's vampires, we would get an agenda point. Now, if it's someone that's an opponent that's not our rival, we don't get it, only if it's our rival that was set up at the beginning of the game. Now, so far we've talked about some of the beginning phase, we talked about the action phase. There's actually one action we haven't talked about yet, we'll get to that in just a moment. And now we're gonna go to the end phase at each player. Now remember, each player is going through this, beginning phase, action phase, end phase, and then the next player will do so, and so on and so forth. Then you're gonna go to the Torpor and Mending steps. So you're gonna take 1 blood from the general supply, not your own, and you're gonna place it on every one of your vampires that are in Torpor. During the mending step, you may discard 1 card to mend a vampire that you control, giving it 1 blood. You may perform this discard to mend for any number of your vampires, but each may only mend once per turn. Now, if we did it for Ty like this, because he would have 3 blood, and this is his blood potency level, he would ready, and he would get moved right to the Haven. And you would go ahead and put them back into your Haven. Now in this step, you may have Torpor abilities that would happen now as well. Now if this occurs outside of the end phase, you can actually move right into the streets and or act if you want to. Then you may have cards that trigger at the end of your turn. These could be events, havens, and or vampires. The next part of the end stage is the Antagonist Step, and this is done by the Special Affairs Division, also known as SAD. Now, these are event cards that could come up throughout the game. There's plenty of them in the deck. Now, these are essentially members of the Second Inquisition, a secret organization within the world's intelligence agencies seeking to exterminate vampires. Now, these essentially are neutral antagonists who attack your coterie of vampires during this end phase step. Each of those SAD cards deal 1 aggravated damage to a vampire of your choosing in your own coterie. Keep in mind that each of these cards have 1 intel and they stack, so if there's 3 of these, they'd actually have 3 intel that could infiltrate even the most secure havens. And then you'll draw 2 cards, again, choosing which deck to draw each card from, both from the same or 2 different ones. You can decide, draw 1 card and then decide which one to draw from the second one. And remember, all of this is on your player aid as well. So now that you've seen a full turn sequence, let's go back to that beginning phase because there are some steps I skipped that wouldn't have made sense if you didn't know anything about the game. Because that first step is the city deck step. Now let's say we are the player with the red tokens. We had 1 on there from an ongoing event. When it comes back to our turn, we would put this back into the general supply, not our own, and this would get discarded. Now notice there is a prestige token from another player. When it becomes that player's turn, that will be removed. Then you would simply draw 1 card. Remember, at the beginning of the game, in the first turn, the player drew as many cards as number of players. For every turn after that, and for all players, you just draw 1 card. And you would place it here like this. It's immortal, so it would just stay there. Now, if instead it was an event that was drawn, you would resolve that event, and then you would burn that card. It would be removed from the game. Then you might have some start turn step abilities on cards. If you do those. Then you'd ready and return. So here we have a vampire that was in the street. So it's going to come back and ready, and it's going to be going into my haven. Now this one's in the haven. It had an attachment that was exhausted in turns. We will also move that. So you're basically bringing everybody back to your havens and turning all the cards vertical like this. Now earlier I mentioned in the action phase that there was 1 action that I had left out. We're going to talk about that now because at the time it teaches concepts that I didn't want to teach then because we needed some more foundational information, and this will flow well into some of the advanced cards that we'll finish with this video. One of the city deck cards is the Prince of San Francisco. It's a title card. Now, the cool thing of this is if you have this, at the start of your turn, you're going to gain 1 prestige and 1 agenda point, which is great because, again, you get to 13 and you win. Now, this character also has +2 influence. We'll talk about influence right after this. And its secrecy is always 0. So even if it's in its haven, its secrecy is always 0. So what you can do for an action, you can take a vampire that is readied in the streets and exhaust it to try to take claim to this card. However, starting with the player to your left and going clockwise, each of your foes may exhaust also 1 ready vampire that they control. It doesn't matter where they are, in the streets or in their haven, to attack this claimant as if it were their own turn. Now these attacks can't be blocked or reacted to, but the damage prevention abilities and attributes will mitigate damage And the claimant is not essentially, protected by any secrecy during these attacks. Now, when it comes around to the person who is your rival, in addition to the vampire that they are exhausting, they can also use attack cards, but none of the other normal foes can use attack cards. Now, each of these attacks, again, start clockwise from this player, and each of those attacks are resolved separately. Now, if the damage by these attacks is enough to defeat the claimant, then they do not gain the title of the Prince of the City. Then it remains right in the streets. Now, if they did survive any or all attacks that came to them, then they could claim it, and that could be attached to them. Now, if you already had a title attached to this vampire, it would get removed and it would be replaced with this one. And this is the only title card that does this. Now, if you already had 3 attachments, since that's the max, you would burn one of those cards to make room for this. Now, this brings us into the more advanced cards and concepts in the game, because this title allows you to get +2 influence. And if you remember, your leader gives you 1 influence. Now, influence is a measure of how much political sway a vampire has. Now, it's not a tangible resource like prestige or blood, but certain cards, tokens, and abilities will grant you influence you can exert. Now, schemes are cards that pose a yes or no question to the players, and those players will exert influence to decide the outcome. For example, influence conflict should each player mend 4 blood on a character in their coterie or in Torpor. Now, at this point, all the players are going to go around and be able to talk about whether they're going to vote yes or no. Now, as you can see, this is an action card, so you'd need to exhaust a vampire in order to play this. Now, the active player would exert as much influence as they want, and this would be for a yes. And other players will then, in clockwise order, exert influence as they please or stay out of it. Now, you can poll your foes to see what they think about this matter, and you can even make deals, but if you do make a deal and promise something, you have to keep it. And you cannot give away prestige, blood, agenda, or any cards. Some legal ways of doing this is like saying, I'll pay for your next intel discard against your rival, or I won't attack you unless you have 9 or more agenda. And again, if you promise to answer the question a certain way, you must. Now, when deciding if you're going to exert influence from a vampire, you either have to exert all of it or none of it. And if you do exert the influence, then you get this no influence token, which shows you that you cannot exert influence from this vampire again on this turn. And you can exert influence from multiple vampires. In addition to that, you can play an influence modifier card face down in front of you, and those aren't cards that are in the pre-constructed deck, but they're in the deck that I told you not to open until you've played a few games. You can also secretly put any number of prestige from your own supply into your hand, and each of these are going to turn into an influence for each of them. But again, this is secret and other players don't know how many you have. And now you're going to say how much visible influence you have, and then say yes or no. Now, you can bluff up until this part, but remember, if you made deals with somebody, you've got to keep them. This will go clockwise to each player doing this until all players have had a chance to do so, and then you'll resolve this influence conflict. And then anyone that played the influence modifier cards will flip them up, and then everyone reveals the amount of secret prestige they put in their hand to have influence, and you total them all up. Now, if there's more influence for yeses than nos, or it's tied, then the yeses happen, and this card will activate, and then it will be discarded. If there's more no's than yeses, then it does not happen and it just simply gets discarded without any more effect. Anyone on the winning side needs to take any of those prestige that they were using for secret influence to then discard them into the general supply, but those that did not win, they gain those back into their own supply. Now, we talked a little about titles when we talked about the Prince of the City. Now, generally speaking, each vampire may have only 1 title, and they can never be replaced unless it's the Prince of the City that's replacing it, because that's a special exception for that title. And again, to get a title, you exhaust one of your vampires in a coterie, and then you attach it to that vampire, keeping in mind the blood potency needed to play this card. Now, this one is 1 per player, meaning each player can have it, but this other one over here is unique, which means only 1 player, regardless of which clan they're in, can have this at any one time. However, if a uniquely titled vampire is in Torpor, then another vampire can attach that specific unique title, and the title card from that vampire in Torpor gets discarded. Now, a few more things about the Prince of the City. If you have this and are defeated or burned, the vampire that defeated the prince becomes the new prince and attaches the title. And remember, you can only have 3 attachments. Now, if the player is defeated by other means, like a sad card, then that card is taken from that vampire and is put back in the streets where it can be claimed again. Now, the last card type I'm going to talk about is Conspiracy, and it's an action card, so you must exhaust a vampire in order to play this. Now, you'll place this face down in front of you, but I have it face up just to show you what it looks like, but you'll also place 1 prestige on it. Then, on your turn, you can reveal this card secretly to as many foes as you want. It could be this turn, it could be future turns, it doesn't matter. and then they could decide to place one of their prestige from their own supply on this card or not. And they could do that on each of that controller's card's turn, so it could be over multiple turns they're doing this. And once the card has 4 or more, they may resolve it. They don't have to. They can wait multiple rounds and try and extort more prestige from those. But when they do trigger it, then they target a foe who did not contribute at all. You can tell by the color of the prestige token on there, and that player loses an agenda point, or 2 of them if they have 9 or more agenda. Now that is pretty much most of the details of the rules, but if you want to see miscellaneous rules or specific card clarifications, you can see these on page 16, 17, and 18 of the rulebook. Now you'll continue playing this game in clockwise manner with each player taking their turn going through all 3 of those phases. Now the game will end when any player is either knocked out or any player reaches 13 agenda points. Now if you're the first to reach 13 agenda points, you win right then. Now speaking of knocking out a foe, you remember everyone has their own personal prestige. Now if you cause anyone's prestige to drop to 0, you've knocked them out. You've also done it if you've defeated their last active vampire in their coterie, meaning all the vampires are in Torpor. Now if the player that you knocked out is your rival, you win. Now if you knock out a foe other than your rival, or they're knocked out by effects not controlled by any player, the player holding their rival token gets 3 agenda points. The player who's knocked out removes all of their agendas points, so they wouldn't have any. And then you compare agenda scores, and the one with the highest agenda wins. Now if it's tied, the active player would win. If the active player wasn't one of the ones tied, then you go to player order, the one furthest from the start player. Sort of the highest numbered player, if you will. Sitting just to the right of the start player would win. Well, I hope this helped you dive right into Vampire the Masquerade Rivals Expandable Card Game quicker than you normally would if you had to read the rulebook yourself. Now, if you have any further questions about the rules, I've placed a link below me in the description of this video. That's the best place to ask them, since I'll be notified, but so will Renegade Game Studios.